Barely 2 weeks after President Mnangagwa's current term was extended by 2 years. Barely 2 weeks after the 2028 elections were cancelled, we are already hearing a new campaign to keep ED in office until 2037. Yes, ZANU-PF's Harare province, led by its chairperson, Godwill's Masimire Mbra, has publicly announced plans to push for a resolution calling for ED to remain in office until 2037. They want to formally push for this resolution at the next ZANU-PF National People's Conference. Remember, this is how the push for 2030 started. The resolution that eventually led to the Zimbabwean constitution being amended to allow ED to remain in office until 2030 was made at a ZANU-PF Annual People's Conference, the so-called Resolution Number 1. That resolution started as a slogan. It started as chants at political rallies. Many people dismissed these chants as political noise. But these political chants at rallies eventually became Resolution Number 1. And Resolution Number 1 became CAB 3. CAB 3 is now officially a part of the Zimbabwean constitution. It is now law. That is literally the same template being applied by Harare province. But this time around, the proposal is not merely to keep ED in office until 2030. They now want him to receive another 7 years on top of the 2 years he has already been given. But take note of where this push is coming from. Harare province. This is the same province where politically connected individuals like Kudakwashe Tagwirei and Ascot Sakupanya belong. It is also the same province that co-opted Tagwirei into the ZANU-PF Central Committee, the party's highest decision-making body outside Congress. This came after Tagwirei had spent millions of dollars pampering members of the Harare provincial leadership with money, vehicles, and other benefits. Now a province that he belongs to is seen publicly pushing for another date, 2037. Is that a coincidence? Are we not watching powerful people protecting a political system that also protects their own interests? The question is no longer whether ED wants to remain in office until 2030. The deeper question is whether any date written into the constitution can still be trusted as final. A constitution is supposed to place limits on power. It is supposed to tell leaders that there is a point where their authority ends, regardless of how powerful they have become or how loudly their supporters ask them to remain in power. But once those limits can be repeatedly moved to suit the person already in power, the constitution stops being a boundary and becomes a flexible political tool. Initially, the final date was 2028, and then it became 2030, and now suddenly 2037. So what happens when 2037 arrives? Will another province of ZANU-PF suddenly discover that the country cannot survive without ED until 2044? Surely, at some point, we must ask whether these dates mean anything at all. ED is 83 years old right now, depending on who you ask, of course. You will be 88 in 2030 and 95 in 2037. Are we not watching the beginning of a dynasty? Well, fellow Sazators, slay queens and bingers, socialites, papalites, wasnamalites, varikudyarais, never snamarites. Welcome to the special report. Now, if you're not Zimbabwean, you might be wondering what exactly is happening in the teapot-shaped country. Or maybe you are Zimbabwean, but you don't really follow politics. Well, let me quickly catch you up so that we are all working from the same facts. Let's be on the same page. You see, on the 7th of July, the Zimbabwean president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, signed a constitutional amendment into law. That new law gave him 2 extra years on top of his current term. He is already serving his second term, and under Zimbabwe's current constitution, that is supposed to be his last one. Initially, it was supposed to expire in 2028. So this new law has given him 2 extra years, meaning his current second term is now scheduled to expire in 2030. That is now the new date for the next general election. Zimbabwean presidents can only do a maximum of 2 terms. Any president who wants a 3rd term faces 2 hurdles. There would have to be 2 separate referendums in order for a sitting president to have a 3rd term. In other words, the Zimbabwean constitution would have to be amended 2 times, and those 2 amendments would require separate referendums in order for a sitting president in Zimbabwe to have a 3rd term. So the first referendum is to create a 3rd term, and the second referendum is to allow the sitting president to benefit from that new law that has created a 3rd term. This is because the current constitution does not allow a sitting president to personally benefit from any amendment that creates a 3rd term. In simple terms, even if the Zimbabwean parliament changed the constitution today to allow a 3rd term, President Mnangagwa would still not be allowed to use that new 3rd term. It would only apply to future presidents. So if ED wants a 3rd term, 2 things must happen. Number 1, the Parliament of Zimbabwe must amend the constitution to create a 3rd term. And that amendment must be put to the people to vote yes or no. The people must decide on whether they want that 3rd term or not. That is called a referendum. And even if the people say yes, we want a 3rd term, Mnangagwa would still not be able to benefit from that new law that creates a 3rd term, because this new law would only apply to future presidents. So in order for Mnangagwa to benefit from this new law, there must be another referendum, and people will have to vote yes or no. And the question would be, do you want President Mnangagwa to benefit from this new law that creates a 3rd term? If the people vote yes, then Mnangagwa would be able to get his 3rd term. So ED and his team had a choice: go down the referendum route or find another way. They chose another way. Why? Well, because a referendum was a political gamble. You see, President Mnangagwa has contested 2 presidential elections since the removal of Robert Mugabe. In the best of these 2 elections, his official winning margin was just over 52%. And that was in an election whose outcome was disputed by the opposition and criticized by several international observers, including SADC's own electoral observer mission. In 2018, his official result was even narrower, 50.8%. Now I need you to think about what that means. In both elections, almost half of the people who voted did not believe that ED was the right person to lead Zimbabwe. Whether you support Mnangagwa or you oppose him, that is a deeply divided electoral picture. And that matters because the people who voted in 2023 have now had 2 more years added to Mnangagwa's presidency without ever being asked whether they agree. And those who voted against him must now live with 2 extra years they never consented to. And even those who voted for him in 2023 did not know that they were voting for a presidency that would run until 2030. They believed they were voting under a constitution that limited the presidential term to 2028. And that is where the issue lies. When people vote in an election, they are not just choosing a leader. They are also agreeing to the rules under which that leader will govern them, including how long that leader will remain in office. So what happens when those rules are changed after the election without asking the people again? Can we really say that the consent people gave in 2023 is still the same consent after the term has been extended? That is the question at the heart of this debate. Mnangagwa's team clearly understood the political risks of a referendum. It's not just the opposition opposing Mnangagwa's continued stay in power. Even within ZANU-PF, there is a faction that does not want Mnangagwa to remain in power beyond his current term. A referendum could easily have turned into a proper Bora Musango moment, where discontent quietly expresses itself at the ballot box. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why they avoided the referendum route. But many constitutional experts still argue that if you add extra years to a sitting president's term, you still need a referendum. But ZANU-PF disagrees. It argues that extending the current term does not give the president a 3rd term. Instead, it says the amendment simply changes the election timetable, while the president still remains within the constitutional limit of 2 terms. They argue that adding 2 years on top of Mnangagwa's current term does not in any way tamper with term limits, because tampering with term limits requires a referendum. Now, whether you agree with that interpretation or not, the political thinking behind it is very clear. Instead of asking Zimbabweans to approve a 3rd term in a referendum, they found another way to achieve almost the same result while avoiding the biggest risk of all. That is, putting the question to the people. And barely 2 weeks after securing 2030, we now hear of yet another date for term extension, 2037. As I said in my intro, President Mnangagwa will be 95 in 2037. So what is the end game? Is he going to rule Zimbabwe until the grave? Well, we should be careful not to assume that all this is about extending Mnangagwa's stay in office forever. Power is not only about holding office, it is also about deciding who holds it after you. That is why change is brought by CAP 3 Meta. By removing direct presidential elections and allowing Parliament to choose the next president, ED has changed not just how a president is elected, but also the balance of power in the succession process. If Parliament is where the next president will be chosen, then influence over Parliament becomes influence over the succession process. Now, from that perspective, extending Mnangagwa's stay in office may not be the only objective. It may also be about creating enough time and political space to ensure that when he eventually leaves office, power passes to someone he trusts, someone likely to protect his political, personal, and economic interests. When viewed through that lens, Mnangagwa's relationship with VP Chiwenga becomes important. Since 2021, ED has steadily weakened VP Chiwenga's position. I explained this in detail in a video that I made a week ago. But whether that means Chiwenga can never become president is another question. But it is difficult to imagine that Mnangagwa would feel comfortable and safe under a Chiwenga presidency. History gives leaders reasons, plenty of reasons, to think this way. Former presidents do not always enjoy good relationships with the people who succeed them. We have seen tensions emerge in Zambia, South Africa, and even Botswana. Zimbabwe itself provides perhaps the clearest example. Succession is often the moment when yesterday's allies become today's rivals. Once a successor controls the state, they no longer depend on the person who brought them to power. Their interests can quickly diverge. A leader who understands that reality will naturally think not only about how long to remain in office, but also about who inherits power when they eventually leave. So, when you analyze this from that perspective, a 2030 and indeed a 2037 may not only be about extending Mnangagwa's stay in power. It may also be about shaping the succession itself. Could Mnangagwa be preparing the ground for one of his close associates to take over? Or is this about clearing the way for one of his sons to take over? Are we witnessing the beginning of a dynasty? Well, whatever happens, I'll be here to marinate you with all the details without fear or favor, because on this platform, we say it as it is. And as always, thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoy the content, please like and share.